One of the biggest topics in franchising, and it seems like this is a perpetual issue or one, it's on our radar and it's going to stay there, is joint employer liability. And for franchisors, the questions are, how do you manage the risk of joint employer liability? Can you limit your exposure? And also from a brand perspective, should you be engaging in a deeper way into how your franchisees are managing their employees? Today, we're going to have a great conversation with Luke Fryer, president of Harri. It's much more than an HR management platform. And one of the things that Luke and I were discussing even before we started this video, which I thought was great that Luke brought up. He said, Charles, are we going to talk about direct implications of joint employer liability and also indirect? And that struck me because Luke is focused not only on, hey, we may have these issues, California law, NLRB, where we have to manage whether or not as a franchisor we're liable for franchisee labor law violations. But Luke brings another perspective with the Harri platform, which is, hey, setting aside joint employer, we need a great experience for customers. We need great operations, brand integrity. So we're going to talk about direct and indirect. Direct is politicians attacking franchisors with joint employer liability. And indirect is, hey, we need our brands to work. Luke, I'm glad we're spending time together. This is like a monumental topic.
Yeah, it's bubbling up in many. It's bubbling up at a national level, and it's bubbling up in I think 7 or 8 jurisdictions at the moment. Of course, these concepts are kind of often incubated in California, and then other jurisdictions catch on quickly. I think there's some surprising markets that given the political landscape in certain markets, I think there's some surprising follow-on sort of proposed rules, but that's probably a conversation for another day. But this is, the concept of joint employer and really trying to make that a fundamental pillar of the franchisor-franchisee relationship is it's a trend that's gaining a lot of traction very quickly.
And we have a lot to cover. And what I love is, and we'll dive, I mean, you're an expert in this area and we'll talk about Harri. And for those who are watching the video, joint employer liability, it's a concept that's come about through the NLRB, and typically it ebbs and flows based on who's in running what office. But the concept conceptually is that in theory, a franchisor can be liable for the Employment Act's labor wage violations of a franchisee. And in many ways, this undoes, centuries of contract law, right? Franchisor licenses the right to a franchisee to operate a location. Franchisee is an independently owned and operated business, and the franchisee then hires their employees. Well, at the NLRB and at state levels, basically politicians are looking for a way, where can we hold the franchisor liable? And thus comes the creation of joint employer liability, of saying that a franchisor could be liable for franchisee actions, even though they're independent companies. And we're not going to dive into why that's wrong or right, but how to manage all of this, and to put a good perspective, and most important, really gain insights from Luke, which Harri is an extremely technology-driven company. And I know their team's done a deep dive into all these issues, and that's what we're going to discuss today. Luke, just an overview, if you could just let everyone know what Harri is and what your mission is.
We're an end-to-end employee technology platform. We say an employee experience platform focused on every aspect of the employee life cycle, from the first time someone connects with a client's brand right the way through the hiring process, day-to-day workforce management, and growing, developing, and retaining people. So it's an end-to-end technology platform very much focused on frontline employees, and we have a particular area of focus in hospitality, meaning hotels and restaurants.
Yeah, and we were, when we spoke a couple of months ago, I mean, at that time, there was California legislation that was circulating where they were attempting to impute and by law state that every franchisor has a joint employer relationship with the franchisee and liability in the fast food industry. And recently we were talking that ultimately didn't make it through, but I'm sure there'll be other attempts there.
Yeah, I think it's certainly at the NLRB level. There are variations of that theme working through there at the moment. Similar legislation has been docketed in, or it's come on the agenda in, I think, New York, Virginia, Connecticut, Massachusetts. So there's a range of different jurisdictions that are picking up on this concept. So none of them have made their way through. And I think for the health of the franchisor-franchisee model, it's important that they don't. But it is certainly something that there are particular forces at play that are really, pushing this hard.
Luke, you've given this so much thought, and you've built an organization around this employee experience. So I don't want to do a disservice here, because I think you have great insights. If you could frame this up for everyone, number one, how you describe issues in terms of joint employer liability, how you see it, or how franchisors should be viewing it today and down the line. And then ultimately, what you recommend in terms of best practices on how franchisors should approach joint employer liability issues, address them, and then ultimately, Harri, and everything else in terms of the employee experience.
So there's a lot there. So I'll try.
Yeah, no, I'm going to sit back and enjoy now.
So I think to approach it sort of one step at a time, I think for the longest time, because of so what is joint employer? Joint employer practically is, here's a franchisee, presumably a smaller business. There's lots of big franchisees across the US, as we know, but here's a franchisee who employs people. And the things, in that employment relationship, let's assume that the franchisee has done something wrong, either consciously or unconsciously, with unconsciously being the majority of the use cases, right? This could be, we haven't paid overtime correctly. There's been, we've discriminated in the way we've hired. We've, managed breaks incorrectly. So there could be, there could be a range of actions in hiring processes, in employee interactions, in wage and hour management, whatever aspect of the employee relationship it is. And, someone comes to, hold the franchisee accountable. And what they would look to do is bring the franchisor into that process, because presumably the franchisor is a bigger business, has more money, and would want to settle a claim, whatever type of claim that might be, faster, because it's going to be more expensive for them to defend it. And so the franchisor playbook for the longest time has been avoid creating conditions where a joint employer relationship could be established by a plaintiff. And, quite specifically, that meant franchisors have avoided prescribing the tools by which people and franchisees manage their employees. And that's actually a very unique part of the franchisor playbook, because obviously from a franchise perspective, I've been a franchisee in 6 different systems now. I started my career with the first Burger King franchise in Australia back in 1999. And franchising, you're buying a system, which is a kit of parts. And that kit of parts is everything from, brand to menu to operations manuals, construction manuals. Increasingly there's a technology stack that is part of, today very much a technology stack is part of the franchise, kit of parts. What isn't included there is how to run your people, component or system within that toolkit. And what that means is, and the reason franchisors do that, obviously, if they compel a franchisee to take a particular kind of tool and that tool fails, right, and that becomes the reason for whatever employment action is being taken, right, it's very easy to establish a joint employer relationship. We were using the timekeeping tool you told us to use, for example. So what that means is that it's a very fragmented landscape, right? Within, you could look at a system of franchisees. You might have 1,000 franchisees, 3,000, whatever the number might be, but they will have a very fragmented suite of tools to manage the employee relationship, right? Literally, you might find hundreds of different vendors doing things like, talent acquisition, onboarding, document management, timekeeping, scheduling, whatever it may be. And so the reticence to prescribe employee technology has created quite a significant problem in that there is not a coordinated and strategic approach to managing employees often in franchise systems. But roll forward to today, and I guess every aspect of the employee equation has become far more profound and far more closely linked to the underlying health of the business model, the franchisee's business model, and by default, the franchisor's business model. And quite specifically, those conditions are you've got less employees to choose from, right? You've seen a fundamental contraction in the supply base of talent, especially into the demographic that is the primary feeder for the franchisee labor pool, which is kind of 18 to 30-year-olds. That part of the population is actually decreasing as an overall percentage of the population. Number two, you've seen a rapid increase in the underlying wage cost structure in most business models. And that wage cost has increased at a greater rate than inflation, at a rate that's greater than our ability to increase prices to cover those costs. Number three, you've seen a rampant increase in the complexity and the velocity of the regulatory environment. And the fourth leg of this quite painful stool is a fundamental shift in the mindset of frontline employees. They're significantly more empowered on this side of the pandemic than they were, 3-4 years ago. They're questioning the type of work. They demand greater flexibility, and it's a different mindset. So when you put those four things together, you actually have you have a perfect storm of conditions that are threatening the most important input into the franchise business model. And, our lens is very much through the restaurant world, which is obviously very labor intensive, but this applies across all franchises. And because of those complexities, the ability to attract employees, retain them, grow them, manage them, deploy them optimally from a scheduling perspective, and mitigate risk and cost associated with compliance. All of these things are starting to become very mission critical to the franchisee's ability to, in many cases, open their doors and, of course, to run their businesses profitably and in an enduring way. Regardless of the kind of regulatory and let's call it the political climate related to joint employer, franchisors now are having to take a strategic view as how to help their franchisees manage these concepts of hiring, of day-to-day workforce management, of compliance, because the franchisees often aren't equipped in their own right to manage those things. And if they don't get it right, it impacts the unit profitability to the point where the business model becomes unviable. So franchisors, regardless of the pressure of potential joint employer, franchisors are having to get strategic on this. And we're seeing the biggest players in the market, lean in very heavily, looking to obviously carefully navigate the application of that technology, but taking a very clear view about helping their franchisees with the employee, with the labor equation, to improve the resilience of their business model.
And that's big. If I could frame that up, I mean, I think when you're speaking with franchisors or restaurant brands, and they, if they say one of our clients, it'd be Charles, in our agreements, we have clauses that state we don't manage or get involved in the employment relationship, statements about joint employer. We advise our clients on operations manuals not to include those relationship items. Your point would be that's great advice by Charles, but that legal advice in a vacuum may make sense, but you, franchisor and brand, you have bigger issues, right? Because we want to succeed. Your franchisees do require some support on the employment level. Your brand requires it. And so how do we deal with this? And I think from a more important perspective, your perspective is and maybe, hey, Charles, like number one, politicians are going to try to force this joint employer risks one way or another, right? All my contract provisions can't outdo a California legislature or the NLRB that just imposes this joint employment relationship. We haven't gotten there completely yet. But your other point, I think, is, hey, we also need a way to lean into this. And while it's unfortunate, just make it just another entrepreneurial obstacle that we need to bypass, because we have a bigger goal here, which is brand integrity, franchisee performance. And I think that's your perspective. And I think it's very unique because it's very easy for everyone to say, just avoid joint employer. And your point is, but that's not solving the bigger issue.
And I think the bigger issue, like if you think from the franchisee's perspective, if they're not equipped, we sort of think of the world as compliance markets and not so compliant. There's obviously compliance matters in every market, but there are very rigorous compliance requirements in markets like New York and California, Pacific Northwest, and so on. So if we think about compliance markets, and if you think of the average franchisee profile, the complexity of the laws around how you employ, how you manage an employee today, especially the likes of, break rules, predictive scheduling, often called fair work week laws, right? These are incredibly complex rules. They have to be managed by technology. And that means they have to be often managed by scheduling and timekeeping technology. And those scheduling and timekeeping technologies need to work within the context of the franchise system, which means they often have to be connected to a central database from a sales perspective, so that the schedule can work with sale. The schedule can deploy employees in line with the sales pattern of the business. Often there's a labor model that's kind of built and maintained by the franchisor that needs to go into the scheduling system. And so the franchisee often needs to have a tool that is, if not implicitly mandated by the franchisor, at least developed and optimized by the franchisor to be able to schedule their employees, to be able to comply with the rules. And so unless the franchisor is strategic and proactive there, the franchisees are sitting there trying to use different tools that either are suboptimal for the needs of scheduling or suboptimal for trying to handle compliance. That's a specific example, but it applies to a huge portion of the population. Then in non-compliance markets, where you may not have something like Fair Work Week, everyone, certainly in the food, in the restaurant franchise world, there is a heavy reliance on minors just because of the composition of the labor market. And in fact, the reliance on minors is increasing given the lack of availability of 18 to 30-year-olds on a proportional basis. And managing minors is really complex. And it's also politically very sensitive. And there is a huge amount of brand risk if you're not, managing the minor relationship within those very prescriptive and difficult to follow rules. You can't do that. Your managers can't do that in the course of a shift unless they've got technology preventing issues and monitoring issues. And again, if the franchisor isn't part of the discussion and part of the process of optimizing the development of that technology, right? The franchisees are sitting there really without the resources to do those things well. That represents financial and legal risk for the franchisee and huge brand risk for the franchisor.
Yeah, it's critical. Luke, if we're building a playbook for franchisors on best practices, on at least conceptually how to approach this or think about it, and then practically some tools and successes that they could be looking for, and then pair this with your experiences with Harri, what Harri does for brands and what you've done. If you could put together a couple of points of, if we, in our playbook and in our arsenal, and I know a lot of this is going to relate to solutions you've created for Harri, but and I think everyone should check out your platform, but these are important conceptual points I think everyone needs to focus on. What would be some of those playbook items?
So I think it starts at the highest level of we as a franchisor want to help our franchisees, right, improve the operations and profitability of their business. And actually, the biggest expense line in the business model, certainly from a food perspective, is labor. It's going to be 25. That's not going to be 25. It's going to be 30, 33%. It's going to be it's your highest cost item. By the way, it's the key item that you need to focus on for intradaily profitability. And it's the item in the P&L that takes the greatest amount of operational bandwidth. So we, as a strategic franchisor interested in the underlying health and profitability of our franchisees, are going to help our franchisees by developing a single platform to manage all things people, right? And we're going to actually infuse that with the branding and the culture and the tone and voice that's right for our brand as a franchisor, right? Because that actually is a big part of the employment decision, both to join a brand and stay at a brand. We're going to work on the technical aspects, right, and the mechanics of optimizing the deployment of labor through better labor models and better sales feeds. And we're also going to realize that as a franchisor, the enduring health of the system is going to be firstly around having franchisees that are profitable and healthy, but franchisees that can grow. And for the best franchisees, the growers, so to speak, are really good at cultivating talent. And so a key part of that is how do we also take a strategic approach to growing and developing talent? Beyond our training system, what does it look like as a franchisor to create growth paths that our franchisees can deliver for their employees, improving that management layer that's needed to accelerate growth, right? And also some of the very smart franchisees, franchisors, franchise systems, for example, Jersey Mike's is just brilliant at this. It's also how they take those employees and grow them into franchisees in their own right, which is, the best systems cultivate the talent and they help their franchisees cultivate the talent and they help people become franchisees. That is absolutely something that can be supercharged by technology. So stepping back, the franchisor that says, I'm actually going to create an end-to-end people platform that is as important to the success of my franchise system as my menu, as my operations manual, as my marketing platform, right? They're the best in the market are doing that right now.
Luke, what are some of the things, because I think it helps to see. So hypothetically, some of your brands that you work with, before Harri, they experienced a fragmented approach to labor or talent. And after, here's what they're experiencing. I'm not saying this just because Harri's a great platform. I'm saying it because what could that world look like for me as a franchisor? I could go from X to Y. And what are some of the tangible things that I'm helping to drive my system with a platform like Harri?
So from a franchisor's perspective, so look, just imagine a world where joint employer actually kicks in and gains traction, right? The first thing you're going to want to know is that each and every one of your franchisees and their employees are operating in a compliant way every day, right? You're going to want to, you need to understand what's happening from a workflow perspective. You're going to want to harvest data that tells you what's going on, and you're going to need to be very much aware, not having the ability to run reports from a year ago as to what went wrong. You're going to have to get proactive, and you have to get proactive through aggregating relevant data into a live view of risk of what's going on, right? And then it's not a leap of, it's not a technological miracle that machine learning can start to look at all the things that are going on in the way employees are behaving within time and attendance in their schedules to help you predict, where you may have a problem in the future. That's in the world of, put that in the bucket of if joint employer comes along. franchisors are going to need to behave very differently in terms of how they proactively interact in the compliance practices of their franchisees. That hasn't yet happened today. So let's put that over here. On the other side, it is, as a franchisor, how can I improve the health of my overall system, right? Through, helping better manage and better understand what's going on in the employer-employee relationship, in workforce management practices, in recruitment practices. So one of the things, look, I think a few of the key groups we work with track employee retention. Employee retention is a leading indicator of business health. You can directly correlate employee retention to both revenue and unit level EBITDA with a fairly high degree of accuracy, right? So franchisors kind of sporadically measure that, especially if we think in the limited service world. Sub 90-day employee retention is a very important data point, because it kind of tells you how well you're hiring, how well you're training and inducting. And so getting quite strategic and very focused on the trends of employee retention at the franchisee level is one key area. The next thing, it's actually understanding employee sentiment, right? And this has been very difficult, because at the end of the day, the frontline workforce is hard to reach. And so actually getting a meaningful understanding of employee sentiment and how employees are reacting to different market conditions, to things like LTOs, different product releases, right? We might do a brand change. We might change uniforms. What are employees actually thinking about that? That's usually something that's contained at the franchisee level and doesn't really make its way up with high fidelity to a franchisor. What we want to be able to do is get that employee sentiment in a consistent and clear way delivered to the franchisor level, so they can really understand the pulse, if you will, of that sentiment, of the people that are actually at the front line, serving the product, delivering the service, delivering the brand experience that the franchisor cares so much about. The next bucket here is, do the people at the front line actually know what's going on? We've just released a new product. We have a new initiative. This is our focus as a system for this year. It could be product, it could be operations, it could be a range of different initiatives. How do those actually reach a frontline employee and the people who manage them, right? These things are sent to a franchisee, maybe think about it, it's communicated, a PDF is sent by email to a franchisee, and it's often up to that franchisee to then get the message through to the people that actually do the work, actually serve the customers. That whole concept of effective system-wide communication within the franchisor landscape is very, very underserved, right? Very fragmented. And what we want to be able to do is deliver, and there's always aspects of the franchisor-franchisee relationship. Not every type of communication is appropriate for that kind of channel. But what we're working on is have worked on is the ability for a franchisor to send messages right the way through to a frontline employee that reach them when they clock in and through their app, so that we can actually get this concept of 100% system-wide communication cut through. People who know what's going on are just fundamentally more bought in and engaged and more likely to deliver a better guest experience.
So at the franchisor level, on your system, I'm going to be looking at system-wide dashboards. And then at the franchisee level, they're going to be controlling their own little universe and what they see, and your, the other tools in terms of integrating with employees. And then, so as a franchisor, I'd be able to also see compliance factors for franchisees, what practices they're following, and how they're managing the employment relationship. It becomes very interesting because, Luke, when you start speaking in terms of frontline employees, that becomes very powerful, because that's the customer experience. And it's so interesting for me to hear your perspective on it. I do with our clients also, but I mean, it's just very easy to say, take a protective stance against joint employer or these relationships, but that's impossible. It really is for a brand. And so with platforms like Harry and even the approach is, okay, if we're going to have to deal with this, let's create a tool where our franchisees don't get in trouble,
I
and
think
let's build that experience for the customers.
I think protective and proactive are not mutually exclusive,
Right.
right? Like
Well, yeah.
there are very specific legal. I'm not a lawyer, and I won't pretend to advise on this, but there are very specific things that can be done in how this technology, how technology strategies, and it's not just technology, but it's primarily technology, how those strategies can be, by the way, in a very positively way, in a very positive way, they can be workshopped, collaboratively between franchisees and franchisors to come up with a great solution, and then, distribute, offered, recommended, whatever language you want to use, but then, distribute it out to these systems in a way that does not, trip those legal kind of tripwires that we know create problems. So,
Yeah. No, I'm sorry, Luke. What I love about this is it's like, hey, let's turn this into a win, because you need to be focusing on these issues anyway. I mean, that's just a great perspective.
it's just the thing that gets powerful is when you start to understand how employees are thinking, feeling, behaving, and performing, right? Because all of that can, if you got the right tools, those concepts, some of them are soft, some of them are not, those concepts all can be tracked and monitored by data. And you can take that employee data and correlate it with business performance and start to understand the health of the system and start to get predictive on the health of your system and understand what a great franchisee looks like in terms of business health and how their employment behaviors, right, how they act as employers, how that helps improve the health of their business, and then get those learnings, right, and monitor those behaviors across the rest of the system. Because ultimately it's the ability to drive the business performance through employee performance that is the difference between, a healthy system and a not so healthy system. Franchisors can do that, get very strategic and very sophisticated. It's, how do you correlate employee sentiment and skills with, speed of service, with customer feedback, with with these very clear operational outcomes that we all monitor. That picture can be painted today, and it's actually not that complex to do.
Well, if you have the right tool, it's the opportunity is tremendous. It's exponential, but also the risk, because if you're not monitoring this, each new unit that opens, you have that exponential universe of employees interacting with customers and brand. I'm actually reflecting internally about, I'm like, we're a small organization, but I'm thinking, why don't we even have our internal surveys and things going on? But Luke, I appreciate this conversation because it's a different perspective. I think everyone's focused one dimensionally, and I'll fault lawyers mostly, which we're a law firm. They're very one dimensional on joint employer risk. It's A and B, and your perspective in the Harri platform is, hey, we have a bigger opportunity here, which is the brand, and here's an integrated solution. And I could tell you there's been so many conversations and many pain points expressed by franchisors. So, and we're going to put some information so people could reach out and take a look at Harri. And if you had predictions for what's ahead, Luke, anything? What's your thought process, or is it, hey, let's just keep building great brands and experiences?
I think look, as someone who's benefited from the franchisee model, I moved to the US and got my, I was a franchise entrepreneur in Australia, moved over to the US. I was able to get my footing in this country that way, and I think many other people have. So the health of that business model is something that I take personally. And so I would hope that joint employer does not, that an aggressive version of joint employer does not take hold, because like many of these things, whether they're well-intentioned or not, it will probably end up being over regulated as it actually flows through. And I think that will create great friction in what is a very important business model for the economy. I think beyond that, there are trends around how unions are operating at the moment. There's trends around certain types of rules and regulations that are rapidly accelerating. And I think one way or another, like all franchisors are going to need to get, and by the way, the lawyers are telling them this now. So the lawyers are saying, hey, you can't do these things because it's going to create joint employer. But the lawyers are also realizing the risk around a kind of uncontained catastrophic, issue that has huge impact on the viability of the franchisees and on the brand. And so everyone's having to get proactive.
This is actually a hopeful conversation. I'm excited because if you do manage the risk, I mean, a brand, I mean, it's really that interaction, that connection. I love that's where you guys are focused at Harri. Luke, I appreciate the time today.
Thank you, Charles. I very much appreciate it.